Tonight we'll journey back, softly and slowly, into the world of the Vikings, but not to the battlefield, not to the howling winds of conquest or the clashing of shields. No. Tonight we're going somewhere much more hidden, much more quietly powerful. We'll step into the daily lives of Viking women, their homes, their rituals, their strength. These weren't just passive wives or quiet figures behind great warriors. These were women who held farms together, practiced medicine, owned ships, and even sometimes wielded swords. But don't worry, we'll speak of these things gently, as though we're paging through a very old book, one crinkled page at a time while a soft fire flickers nearby. In the early mornings of a Viking village, before the crows had fully woken and before the mist had lifted, there was often one figure already stirring. A woman, wrapped in heavy woolen layers, stirring the coals in the hearth to life. She would move quietly in the half-light, her breath fogging in the chill, carefully adding small kindling until the flames crackled gently. Viking longhouses were often dark, with low beams and sod-covered roofs. Windows, if they existed, were small and shuttered tight against the wind. But the hearth was everything. It was warmth, cooking, and life. It was sacred. The woman of the house, often called the husfreyja, held authority here. She was no mere servant to her husband. In fact, when the men left for trade or raids, it was she who ruled the household. Her keys would hang prominently at her waist. Practical, yes, but also symbolic. The keys meant control over storage, over the household economy, and over the daily rhythm of life. If you held the keys, you held power. Some women lit incense from imported resins, offering scent to the gods. Others began the day quietly singing Old Norse songs, half lullaby, half prayer, as they kneaded barley dough or spun wool by the hearth. Spinning was not just a chore, it was a cornerstone of society. Viking women spun flax and wool into fine threads, weaving fabric not only for their families but for trade. Some garments traveled as far as Constantinople, traded in bustling markets where spices and silk mingled. To spin was to create. It was time-consuming, meditative work, ideal for storytelling and quiet conversation. Women sat together in circles, their hands in motion, as their voices shared sagas, riddles, and seasonal charms. The distaff, a carved stick used to hold unspun fibers, was often passed down through generations, wrapped in soft fiber like a small torch. And while the spindle twirled, they watched children, stirred stews, or kept an ear out for approaching footsteps in the snowy silence. Spinning was so central that the Norns, the Norse fates, were imagined as spinners of life's threads. To spin was to touch destiny itself. Marriage among the Norse was rarely about romance, but it wasn't loveless either. Often arranged by families, a marriage was a binding of farms, bloodlines, and resources. But Viking women had more say than one might assume. They could reject proposals, and divorce was possible, more common than in many later societies. Weddings were solemn and sacred. The bride would wear her finest dress, adorned with brooches shaped like turtles or animal heads, her hair carefully combed and wound into intricate braids. She might wear a circlet or simple silver jewelry passed down from a grandmother. The ceremony often took place near a stone altar or hearth, involving symbolic gifts and shared mead. A sword might be placed between them, representing lineage and defense, and keys might be handed from mother to daughter as a ritual of stewardship. Later, there would be feasting, roast meats, mead, bread spiced with herbs, songs that told of gods and great deeds would fill the air long into the night, and afterward, the woman would return to her new home, carrying with her not only new duties, but new authority. Viking women were the keepers of herbal knowledge. In a world without modern medicine, they turned to nature, to mosses, flowers, bark, and honey. Elderberry for fever, willow bark for pain. Tiny pouches of dried herbs might be tied to a baby's cradle or simmered into potions for the ill. Midwives were especially respected. Some were old women known in the village for their calm hands and quiet wisdom. They aided births in flickering firelight, whispering soft prayers to Frigg, the goddess of motherhood, as they guided new life into the world. Not every healer was welcomed, though. Some were feared, considered Sidekona, women of magic who worked beyond the accepted line. They might chant, cast bones, or wear strange cloaks made of feathers or cat fur. Still, in every village, people came knocking when sickness struck, and the woman with the herb pouch and the steady hands was the one they trusted most. Imagine stepping inside a Viking longhouse. Not a cold, dark place, as you might expect, but warm and busy with the rhythms of life. These longhouses stretched as long as 30 meters, built with thick wooden beams and turf-covered roofs. Smoke curled softly from the central hearth, and a gentle orange glow shimmered along the worn wooden walls. Here, the Viking woman held not only domestic power, but cultural influence. She managed food stores, fires, and finances. She tended livestock, brewed ale, raised children, and mended sails, all within these timbered walls. The home was her domain, and she ruled it with steady hands. She woke early to tend the fire, always the fire, for it was never allowed to die. The coals were stirred to life, warmth spreading again through the long single room where her family slept, worked, and ate together. Meals were simple but nourishing: porridge made from barley or oats, stewed turnips, smoked fish, occasionally roasted meat if hunting had gone well. The Viking woman knew how to store food through the long winter, curing meat, drying herbs, and making cheese. Ale was brewed at home, often by women. It was not only a drink of pleasure, but of daily hydration. It had to be light, clean, and reliable. She brewed it in large vats using barley, water, and sometimes flavored it with bog myrtle instead of hops. Feasts were times of social power. Hosting a feast was no simple matter. It was an art. Viking women laid out woven tablecloths, arranged meats and breads, and served drinks in horn cups, all while keeping order among guests. A successful feast brought prestige not only to the man who invited, but to the woman who prepared. The spinning wheel came later, but in the Viking age the drop spindle was queen. Women spun wool and flax by hand, twisting fibers into thread. They wove cloth on upright looms, often taller than themselves, threading warp and weft with slow, meditative skill. Clothes weren't just for clothing, it was currency. Linen and wool could be traded for silver, tools, even land. Viking women who were skilled weavers were deeply respected, and their textile rooms were more than workspaces. They were places of quiet economy and ancestral connection. Colors came from nature: birch leaves for yellow, madder root for red, woad for blue. Every tunic, every cloak was a tapestry of local geography. In Norse society, keys were not just tools, they were symbols of authority. Viking women often wore them on their belts, a loud and visible sign that they managed the household's wealth, tools, and sometimes even trade goods. They held authority over storerooms, chests, and pantries, and were expected to guard them wisely. A woman with a large ring of keys was not to be trifled with. She could grant or deny access to supplies, guests, or even her husband's favored drinking horn. The house was hers, and the keys jingling at her side reminded everyone of that. Among the most respected roles a Viking woman could hold was that of healer, a woman of plants and pulses, of salves and prayers. Her skills weren't written down in scrolls, but held in memory and shared in hushed tones, mother to daughter, sister to sister. She would have known how to crush yarrow leaves to stop bleeding, how to boil willow bark to ease pain. She dried lavender for calming baths and mixed honey with herbs for wounds. Her small wooden box of tools, a pestle, some pouches of herbs, a bone needle for stitches, was a precious inheritance. When a child coughed, she brewed thyme tea. When a man returned from battle, she bathed his wounds with boiled sage. Her knowledge was both practical and mystical, a fusion of body and spirit. Not all Viking women stayed close to the hearth. Some walked a more mysterious path, that of the vulva, the seeress, the wise woman who traveled between villages carrying staff, stories, and secrets. She was not young nor beautiful in the usual way. Often elderly, her hair streaked with silver, her garments dyed dark with iron-rich soil, she walked with the slow authority of one who listened to more than just mortal voices. The vulva practiced satyr, a magical tradition involving chants, trances, and rituals. She would sit on a high seat, surrounded by women who sang softly to guide her visions. Through swaying and whispering, she would seek answers from the spirits, speak of coming winters, or divine the outcome of sea voyages. Though feared by some, she was deeply respected. Her presence could turn a gathering solemn, her silence weightier than any speech. Not all magic was grand. Much of it was subtle, domestic, tied to love, health, and happiness. A Viking woman might tie tiny pouches of herbs and bones beneath a mattress to aid fertility. She might whisper a blessing over a newborn's cradle or carve protective runes into the doorframe. To win a man's affection or protect herself from one, she might drop apple slices in honey and chant a rhyme, believing it would sweeten the heart. These rituals weren't superstitious to her. They were part of the fabric of life. Many wore small amulets, Thor's hammer for strength, or a bronze fertility symbol near the chest. These weren't mere decorations, they were anchors of hope and heritage, worn close to the heart. Death was not an end, not in the Viking mind. Women were carefully buried, often with tokens of their life's role. A farmer's wife might have been laid to rest with her spindle and loom weights. A wealthy woman might have had keys, beads, and imported silks. A vulva could be buried with her staff and sacrificed animals. Some women were given ship burials, set inside wooden boats with goods, food, and treasures to accompany them into the afterlife. These burials tell us how respected Viking women could be. Their grave goods whisper stories to us, tales of love, leadership, motherhood, and magic. Quiet, dignified stories that echo across the centuries. Among the most constant tasks for Viking women was spinning. From dawn to dusk, thread was needed, for clothing, sails, blankets, and bindings. Women combed wool from sheep, spun it using a drop spindle, and wove it tightly on looms. This wasn't idle work, it was essential. Ships needed sails, and sails were made from women's woven wool, tight enough to catch the wind, strong enough to cross seas. A woman's skill with cloth could determine the survival of a voyage. Loom weights were often found in longhouses and in graves, showing how central this work was. Even high-status women took pride in weaving. A well-dyed cloak, a warm tunic, or a linen underdress was both a necessity and a mark of skill. Women in Viking society weren't confined to the home. Many participated in trade. They sold milk, cheese, and spun yarn at markets. Some even managed trade networks when their husbands were away, raiding or voyaging. A wealthy woman might oversee farm production, negotiate contracts, or ensure shipments of goods to other villages. There is archaeological evidence of women's involvement in the handling of scales, weights, and coins, especially in towns like Hedeby and Burka. In these market scenes, you can imagine a woman behind a stall, her eyes alert, her hands counting goods, her voice calm but firm. She might sell dyed cloth, salt fish, honey mead, or carved wooden combs. She wasn't just a passive wife, she was an entrepreneur, a quiet force in the economy of her people. Craft was everywhere in Viking society, not just blacksmithing and boat building, but in small, skilled handiwork, often done by women. They carved bone combs, made beads from glass or amber, stitched leather shoes, and dyed cloth with crushed berries or bark. Women worked with what was near: antlers for needles, horn for drinking cups, tin and bronze for brooches. The bead trade especially was tied to women. Necklaces weren't just jewelry. They were signs of status, and women made them with care. These items were passed down, gifted in marriage, or buried with the dead. Each piece told a story. A carved comb might say, "I cared for my family." A brooch might whisper, "I traveled far." A glass bead, shimmering blue, might carry memories of the woman who wore it each day. Preparing food was daily labor, but not simple. A Viking woman might wake before dawn to bake barley bread on a stone slab, tend the fire, and check dried fish or meat hung in the rafters. Her pantry was a mental map of seasons. She knew when to gather mushrooms when berries ripened and where wild onions grew. She churned butter, brewed mead, and dried herbs for lean months. In winter, she soaked dried peas and simmered stews. In summer, she baked with goose eggs or added fresh greens. Her food nourished warriors and children alike. But more than that, her meals were rituals of love, care, and ancient rhythm. A Viking woman's day was a quiet marathon. At sunrise, she might collect water from a stream, check on animals, and knead dough. Midday could involve spinning, teaching a child to weave, or trading goods. By evening, she prepared meals and mended clothes, while elders told stories and children leaned sleepily by the hearth. This rhythm, steady, slow, sacred, echoed across generations. Even her rest was woven into duty. She might dream of weaving patterns, of lambing season, or the return of a long-gone ship. Yet in this tireless rhythm was dignity, power, continuity. In the Viking age, love and marriage did not always go hand in hand, but affection could still grow in the quiet spaces of domestic life. Marriages were often arranged between families, with the goal of forming alliances, gaining land, or ensuring a good dowry. But this didn't mean cold hearts. A Viking woman had more agency than many of her medieval counterparts. She could negotiate the terms of marriage through her father or a male kin, and she could, in certain cases, divorce her husband if he mistreated her or failed in his duties. Imagine a wedding scene in a Norse village. Not a church, but a gathering by a hearth. A feast, songs sung, and hands joined over swords and rings. A bride might wear red, the color of life and fertility, and carry the ancestral keys that symbolized her new role in the household. When a woman became a wife, she was given keys. often worn on a brooch at her belt. These keys weren't just for storage chests. They were symbolic. They meant she controlled the household's food, linens, and sometimes the family's wealth. She decided when grain would be ground, how meat would be stored, and who received what share. The key ring a woman wore jingled softly as she walked, a sound everyone in the house recognized. It said, "Here is the keeper of order, the one who balances warmth and discipline, kindness and rules." Sometimes keys were even buried with women, pressed gently into their palms. Reminders that even in death, they were still the keepers of homes. The Viking sagas often focus on battles and ships, but in their quiet corners, they mention soft conversations between husband and wife, gentle teasing over morning bread, the way a man returns home and smiles at the smell of stew, or how a woman saves the last of the honeyed mead for him. Love in the Viking home wasn't loud. It was felt in the rhythms of shared chores, in walking together to the well, in the act of stitching a new tunic for winter or smoothing a brow after a fever. A husband might gift his wife beads from a distant raid, and she might give him a warm cloak for the voyage ahead. Their language was practical, yes, but filled with care. Becoming a mother was both sacred and expected. Children were cherished, and women were deeply involved in their raising. But motherhood also placed women as bridges between generations. They taught the values of hospitality, honor, and survival. Women cared for not only their children, but often their aging parents, younger siblings, and neighbors. They were nurses, midwives, and teachers. Roles passed quietly through memory, not manuals. A Viking mother might sing old songs as she wove, teaching history without a scroll. Or she might tell stories at night while oil lamps flickered. When a husband died, a Viking woman might mourn. But she wasn't always left helpless. Widows often inherited property and managed estates. Some remarried, others remained alone, managing farms or taking in kin. The sagas speak of widows with steel in their voices, making decisions at assemblies or guiding families through lean winters. These women were sometimes feared, sometimes revered. One tale tells of a woman who kept a blade under her skirts, not for war, but to protect her sheep from wolves. Another simply sat by her heart with eyes that missed nothing and a memory long as winter. Loss didn't end their story, it shaped them anew. Among Viking women, one mysterious figure stands out, the vulva, pronounced vulvu. She was a seeress, a wise woman, and a practitioner of cider, a kind of Norse magic that twisted fate and glimpsed into the future. She did not live as others did. Often she traveled from village to village, cloaked in blue or black, her staff carved with symbols. People would offer her food, gifts, even silver, in exchange for her visions. Her rituals were slow and hypnotic, chanting, rhythmic movements, and invocation of spirits. She would enter a trance and whisper what she saw, the future of a marriage, the fate of a voyage, or the healing of a child. The vulva was both feared and honored. She stood apart, yet was vital. Cider was considered a feminine art. Even Odin, the chief Norse god, learned it, and was ridiculed for doing so. For Viking society, this magic was deeply tied to womanhood. It involved not just seeing, but shaping, weaving spells like threads. Viking women who practiced cedar might influence love, protect warriors, curse enemies, or calm storms. The magic often involved spinning or weaving, symbolic of controlling fate, like the Norns who wove the destinies of all beings. Spindles, staff, and special herbs were used, and the process was slow, methodical, almost sleepy in its rhythm. There were no flashing lights or explosions, just quiet, breath, voice, and the will to change. Not all Viking women practiced cedar, but many held healing knowledge passed down through generations. Herbs, roots, bark, and oils. These were their tools, drawn from woods and fields. A woman might know which leaves cured fever or what root could ease childbirth. She might make salves, poultices, or warming teas, all with care and quiet skill. There were no formal apothecaries. The knowledge lived in memory, in songs, and in the hands of those who stirred pots over slow fires or tied bundles of drying plants above the hearth. Some women were known for their healing touch, and neighbors walked miles to ask for their help. Viking women often took on the role of protector of the home, not with swords, but with rituals. Charms were hung above doorways, sometimes small bones or woven symbols. Ashes from sacred fires might be sprinkled to keep spirits away. Simple acts became sacred, sweeping the doorway in a certain direction, whispering a blessing before bed, placing a special stone beneath a child's pillow. These quiet acts didn't need belief in gods and only care and intention. Just as food gave life, these rituals gave comfort, like wrapping your home in invisible threads of safety. To many Viking women, spinning yarn or weaving fabric wasn't just a chore, it was symbolic. Every thread drawn from flax, every knot tied, echoed the Norns, the fate weavers of Norse myth who determined every life's path. Runes, the Norse alphabet, were sometimes etched by women into wooden charms, stones, or combs. Each symbol held weight for love, health, or safe passage. A mother might carve runes into a comb she gave her daughter, or whisper them into the folds of a newly woven blanket. Soft acts of magic, quiet and deeply human. In the Viking world, childbirth was not just a moment. It was a passage, a deeply sacred transition. Viking women gave birth at home, surrounded by the older women of the village, mothers, midwives, and sisters. The room would be kept warm with fire, and herbs would be hung or burned to ease pain and protect the child. There was no sterile silence, only whispered prayers, soft cloths, and the sounds of women helping women. If the birth was successful, which in those times was never guaranteed, the newborn was washed, wrapped in wool, and then named on the 9th day, during a ceremony called nafist. A bowl of water would be placed before the child. It was sprinkled over their tiny forehead, not unlike later Christian baptisms, to welcome them into the family and into fate. Babies in Viking homes were swaddled tightly and kept close to the body, tucked into wool, fur, and linen. Cradles were carved from wood, often handed down for generations. Mothers nursed their children, rocked them gently, and sang old lullabies passed down from their grandmothers. These were not loud or dramatic. They spoke of nature, animals, the sea, and protection. Viking mothers were attentive and careful. While life outside could be harsh, they worked to make the home a small sanctuary. Toys were simple, little carved animals, balls of wool, wooden spoons, or dolls made from scraps of cloth. But more than things, the child received something greater: time, touch, and quiet watching. Children in Viking society didn't have schools. Their lessons came from the home, the land, and stories told at dusk. Girls were taught early to help with food, weaving, and caring for siblings. Boys learned to gather wood, herd animals, or help repair things. But much of the day was still for play. Games included stone tossing, wrestling, and imaginative stories about the gods. A group of children might act out a voyage or create myths of their own. There were no toys that lit up or made noise, only hands, dirt, and endless imagination. Learning was slow and natural, a rhythm, not a rush. Viking children were often named after relatives, especially those who had passed on. It was believed their spirit, wisdom, or strength might live on in the child's soul. Names were meaningful. Some suggested strength, Björn, bear, others beauty, or even fate. Over time, the child would earn nicknames, playful, affectionate titles based on behavior or appearance. As they grew, they learned runes, not for writing essays, but for leaving marks, memories, and prayers. A child might carve a rune onto a toy, a walking stick, or a stone near their home. They were taught stories, not just of Thor and Odin, but of clever women, of loyal sons, of mothers who outwitted fate. It was a quiet unfolding of identity. Being a Viking mother was never easy. Life was hard, food uncertain, and winters long. But her power wasn't in loud words. It was in what she held together. She managed the home, soothed fevers, remembered old remedies, taught songs, wove clothes, and made sure there was always warmth on cold days. She created continuity from one generation to the next. When husbands were at sea or in battle, the mother became the anchor. Children looked to her for steadiness. She held time with her hands, her eyes, her heart. And when her own daughters became women, she passed it all on. Not with speeches, but through daily acts. Viking women were often seen as the keepers of knowledge, not just domestic, but spiritual. While men looked to the gods of war, women knew the spirits of the hearth, the omens of nature, and the secrets of fate. Many households had small rituals passed through the maternal line. They might leave bits of food near the door for spirits, sprinkle herbs for protection, or tie charms into children's clothes. They didn't speak of magic loudly. It was woven into the day like thread in linen, quiet, constant, unseen. Among Viking women, a few held a revered role, the vulva, the seeress. She was not a priestess in the modern sense, but a walker between worlds. With her staff, often tipped with iron or adorned with animal bone, she was believed to speak with the gods, read the strands of fate, and offer spiritual guidance. People came to her for insight on marriage, travel, harvests, or dreams. Her clothing was different too. Richly adorned, often with blue or dark robes, silver necklaces, and glass beads. She might travel from village to village, staying in honored homes and performing sacred rituals at night. She did not shout. She sang in old rhythmic chants that wove sound and memory together. Magic in Viking life wasn't grand. It was small, woven into buttons, carved on doorways, or tied with string. Viking women carved runes into wooden spoons or combs for protection. They whispered blessings while braiding a child's hair or tied special knots to guard against illness. Some believed a woman's spinning thread could bind fate itself, and certain songs sung at the right moment might ensure safe travel or ward off storms. These weren't spells in the modern sense. They were old habits held close, rituals of care passed down like recipes. To outsiders, it may have seemed like nothing. But for Viking women, it was everything. The natural world wasn't just a backdrop for Viking life. It spoke to those who listened. Women observed the phases of the moon for planting or childbirth. They noted the way birds flew before journeys or the unusual cry of an owl at dusk. A storm that came too early, a deer that appeared at dawn. These were seen not as coincidences, but messages. Dreams, too, were important. A woman might wake quietly before the fire and whisper her vision to her sister, wondering what it meant and what might come. There was no rush to interpret, just slow thoughtfulness, a kind of spiritual patience. While Viking festivals often featured feasting and song, many of the rituals behind the scenes were guided by women. At Yule, during the winter solstice, women would prepare the home with evergreen branches, baked bread shaped like animals, and candles for the return of the sun. At harvest time they sang songs of gratitude to the land and buried pieces of the first loaf in the soil, offering thanks for the coming season. Children were taught to help, not just by doing, but by watching how their mothers moved, how their grandmothers hummed old tunes, how food and flame came together in sacred timing. It was history, memory, and belief, all in one. In a world without pharmacies, the Viking woman's apothecary was the forest, the heath, the meadow, and the kitchen. She might rise at first light to gather yarrow by the riverside or pick thyme from the edge of a stone wall. She knew which leaves helped digestion, which flowers soothed the skin, and which roots were not to be touched. Some herbs were hung above the hearth to dry. Others were packed in seal oil or ground into pastes. There was no rush, just the quiet repetition of knowledge learned over time. She treated burns with plantain, calmed coughs with honey and elderflower, and made slaves from beeswax and mugwort. And always, she watched, observed, remembered how her own mother had done it. When someone fell ill, the household didn't panic. A woman would lay the person near the hearth, where warmth and light were strongest. She would brew hot teas from meadowsweet and nettle, crush garlic into broths, and lay linen cloths soaked in herb infusions on the forehead. There was a healing rhythm to her care, the same movements, the same reassurances. The fire was always tended, the air kept quiet. Children were taught to bring bowls, wash hands, and observe, learning not just the how, but the feeling. That soft persistence of tending, waiting, checking, and adjusting. She didn't promise miracles. She offered care over and over again. Among the most sacred roles Viking women held was bringing life into the world. There were no doctors or sterile tools. There was knowledge, passed from woman to woman, generation to generation. Midwives, often older women, kept special herbs like raspberry leaf for strength or tansy to ease pain. They whispered prayers to Freya or the earth spirits. They measured contractions by the movement of the moon or the rhythm of breath. Birth was not hidden away. It was part of the cycle of life in the home, sacred and normal all at once. Women gathered in support. They sang lullabies before the baby had even arrived, and afterward they bathed the child in warm water and laid soft linen over mother and infant, wrappy. Contrary to the myths, Vikings did care about cleanliness, and Viking women were the quiet masters of keeping sickness at bay. They boiled water, scrubbed linens, and used lye soap made from ash and fat. They rubbed oils into skin cracked by cold and used vinegar or fermented milk to clean wounds. Washing hair with rainwater was common. Rinses made from birch or chamomile added softness and scent. And if someone's spirit seemed low, they might bake honeyed bread or make a drink of milk with warming herbs while softly humming the songs of their youth. Care wasn't only about pain, it was also about comfort. And when the herbs failed, when the illness couldn't be turned back, Viking women knew how to care for the dying and the living left behind. They washed the body with care. They placed herbs in the hands, lavender, rosemary, or juniper. They sat through the night beside the fire, not speaking loudly, just breathing together. Grief was not something to hide. It moved slowly, like everything else. Women wept, but also told stories. They sang the favorite song of the one who'd passed. When the burial time came, the women prepared the clothes, packed the small tokens for the journey, and sometimes even spoke the final words, steady, soft, and sure. They had done it before. They would do it again. Not because it was easy, but because it was part of being alive. The Viking world was alive. Every hill, every river, every birch grove carried meaning. Every shadow and every light had its place, and at the center of this animated world stood women who knew its quiet language. They whispered to Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and death. They honored Frigg, keeper of home and prophecy. They respected the Norns, those unseen women who wove the threads of fate. Viking women made small offerings, a splash of milk to the earth, a bit of bread left out for land spirits, a soft chant over boiling water. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a quiet rhythm, and every season carried its own sacred feeling. Midsummer with light and laughter, midwinter with candles and deep stillness. They did not believe in heaven or hell as we know them, but in realms, cycles, and the idea that life, death, and memory flowed together. Among the most respected spiritual figures in the Viking world were the Volur, seeresses, oracles, and wise women who held deep knowledge of the spirit world. A Völva was not a priest in the formal sense. She was more like a wandering prophetess, called upon in times of uncertainty, war, or transition. She carried a staff, wore blue or black robes, and often bore strange jewelry or bones from far-off lands. She would arrive quietly and sit by the fire. She might drink an herbal brew or chew roots to enter a trance. Then, before those gathered, she would sing, not with melody, but with ancient rhythmic chanting called satyr. Her voice would rise and fall like the sea, and through it, she might speak of things yet to come, of harvests, journeys, marriages, or dangers. Though not every Viking woman was a Völva, they all knew of them. They were feared, admired, and often lived apart, not because they were outcasts, but because their minds were elsewhere. Even for women not trained as seers, daily life was full of small magics, protective charms, symbolic carvings, and whispered words. A mother might sew runic symbols into a child's tunic to keep them safe from sickness. A wife might carve a protective rune on the frame of her bed. A girl might wear a necklace of amber beads believed to bring love or calm the heart. They tied red thread around wrists to fend off envy. They buried iron nails beneath the doorway to protect from spirits. And when something went wrong, when milk soured too quickly or sheep ran from the pen, they might sprinkle salt and sing a charm just in case. This wasn't superstition. It was patterned care, gentle traditions that brought order to a wild world. Magic was not about power, it was about harmony. In sleep, Viking women believed they could sometimes see beyond. Dreams were never dismissed. They were discussed over breakfast, reflected upon at night. A crow in a dream or water rising too high. These meant something. Some women, older, quiet, and often with a particular gaze, were known as dream readers. They didn't claim to predict, but rather to notice, to help others reflect on symbols. When someone died, the soul was believed to journey, not up or down, but outward, perhaps to the halls of the ancestors or to Freya's fields. perhaps to hell's realm, which was not evil, just quiet, still, and beyond. Women lit candles for 9 nights, sang songs of farewell, and sometimes wore mourning beads made of glass or bone. There was no need to rush grief. The soul needed time, and so did the living. Viking women led rituals and gatherings during key times of the year: the solstices, the harvest, and the first frost. They decorated homes with pine and holly in winter. They lit bonfires and danced in summer fields. They sang songs of harvest and told stories that had been told 100 winters before. These gatherings weren't grand spectacles. They were circles of sisters, daughters, and neighbors, around fires with bread baking, with wool being spun. Even the simplest act, lighting a fire on a dark December morning, could be a rite, a way to call light back into the world. And in all of it, women were at the center, not as priests or rulers, but as keepers of rhythm, of the turning year, of the quiet magic that made life feel whole. In many parts of the Viking world, older women were not pushed aside or ignored. Far from it, they were the memory keepers, the name givers, the quiet decision makers. They knew the herbs to ease childbirth and the ones to ease death. They remembered the way an ancestor used to tell stories, or how to calm a colicky baby with humming and soft salt water. They kept the recipes of slaves, the tales of family, and the rules of the household calendar. Some lived with their children, some with sisters. Others lived quietly at the edge of the village, in small timber houses, warmed with moss insulation and low fires. They did not need to prove themselves. They had already lived. They had birthed, buried, and fed entire generations. And though they rarely raised their voice when they spoke, the young listened. There was no shame in aging among the Norse. Wrinkles were not hidden. Bent backs were not mocked. They were simply part of the cycle. If a woman could no longer weave or carry firewood, she might instead mend clothing, tell stories, or prepare medicinal teas. She might become a midwife, or a matchmaker, or a caretaker of children whose mothers had passed, and she was not expected to be endlessly productive. She was allowed to sit, hum, and rest. The Norse understanding of life was cyclical, not linear. Birth flowed to youth, to strength, to stillness, and back again. They honored this gently and without rush. Even when death approached, it was not feared. It was observed with candles, soft touch, and quiet songs. In Viking culture, names were deeply meaningful, often passed down in memory of someone strong or beloved. It was often the older women who suggested names for newborns. They remembered who in the family line had been kind, or brave, or skilled. And when the fire burned low on dark winter nights, it was the elderly women who told the long stories, the sagas, not the grand Icelandic epics, but the softer ones. The story of a girl who tamed a goose, or the tale of the goat who wouldn't leave the berry bush. Through stories, they passed on values: humor, patience, cleverness, kindness. They might say, "That was your grandmother's way," or "That's the same lullaby I used to sing to your mother." And in this way, they kept the weft and weave of the family intact. In later years, when the body grew slow and slept more frequently, Viking women didn't dread the end. They prepared, in quiet ways. Some arranged for their burial clothing, often a favorite dress, beads worn during important moments, perhaps a bone comb or piece of cloth sewn with runes. Others gave away their tools, a spindle here, a pot there, passing them to daughters or nieces with soft instructions. In certain regions, elderly women would leave their birchwood box of personal treasures in a chosen corner, not for decoration, but for meaning. A scrap of hair, a token from a husband long gone, a child's first tooth. When death came, it was slow and ceremonial. Women from the village gathered. They washed the body, braided her hair, placed her favorite linen beneath her head, spoke softly of her kindness. She wasn't called dead. She was said to be journeying onward. Even after she was gone, her presence lingered, in the scent of baked rye bread, in the way a child hummed while working, in the soft wool gloves someone still wore, years after her hands made them. Her name might be passed to a new baby. Her story was told at the solstice. Her spindle would hang by the fire, and the younger women would remember how she laughed when the sheep escaped, how she sang to the moon, how her fingers were always warm, even in frost. This was not a myth. This was a real, ordinary memory, the kind that makes a woman eternal. In the candlelit corners of Viking homes, life spun on soft rhythms, the whir of the spindle, the scrape of a ladle in a pot, the snip of shears across wool. These were the real sounds of Viking life. The day was carved not by conquest, but by care. Women shaped warmth from raw sheep's wool, order from chaotic seasons, and comfort from the ache of long winters. In many ways, Viking women were like weavers, not only of cloth, but of daily life itself. They understood how to keep a family fed from a stubborn patch of earth, how to soothe a crying baby with a dried herb poultice, how to carry a home not on their backs, but in their hearts. Their strength was not shouted. It was worn quietly, like a warm wool tunic, useful, protective, and deeply known. To be a woman in Viking lands meant to know the seasons intimately, not as a calendar, but as a pattern of planting, harvesting, preserving, and resting. It was in their bones, when to dry fish in the sun, when the apples would ripen, when to let the sheep graze higher in the hills. They understood the language of nature, the caw of a bird signaling frost, the bend of the river before snowmelt, the stillness that preceded storms. Their relationship with the earth wasn't written in books. It was passed down in hands and gestures, in songs and meals. In a world without clocks, they were timekeepers, without needing timepieces. So much of what defined Viking women took place behind walls of timber and turf. Not secrets exactly, but softness, the kind too quiet for records, the quiet brushing of hair before bed, the warmth of two hands kneading bread dough, the whisper of lullabies in languages no longer spoken. Touch mattered. So did affection. Viking women might wear beads gifted by lovers or sew runes into their children's tunics. They exchanged dried flowers, made herbal teas for a friend's sadness. Even in a world that could be harsh, there was space for gentleness. They knew how to hold joy and grief with equal grace. The Viking world was filled with gods and sagas, but women's stories often lived between the lines. In myth, they were seeresses, giantesses, goddesses of love and death. In life, they were often both feared and revered. A vulva, for instance, a female seer, carried staff and spirit. She could divine fate, speak with the dead, and calm the frightened. But even among ordinary women, there was a quiet spiritual strength, a sense of connection to the land, the sky, the invisible forces of the world. They might bless a newborn with a whispered charm, or leave a flower on a gravestone facing west. These weren't theatrical rituals. They were woven into life, the way one breathes without noticing. And now, our journey through history comes to a gentle close. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this quiet time with me. You're always welcome to subscribe and join me again for more softly spoken stories from the past. But for now, rest easy, breathe deeply, and drift wherever your dreams may take you. Sleep well. Good night.